Hey friends, gather close. Tonight Moat want to tell you about a bobcat trapped in a fallen tree on the edge of Thomas' little cabin in the pines. Snow lay thick across the forest floor, soft and muffling, like the world had pressed its hand over the scene to hush it. The lantern in his hand cast long, wavering shadows, the light catching on frost-heavy branches and illuminating the pale streaks of his breath. Somewhere deep in the woods, a bird chirped, a sharp, lonely note that made him pause. And then a crackling mule, broken and trembling, cut through the cold. His heart thumped against ribs grown used to quiet, and he froze, straining to see between the leaning logs and tumbled branches. A pair of amber eyes caught the lantern, reflecting light like tiny autumn suns, cautious but unmistakably alive. You probably would have walked right past her. Most people did. If a story like this softens your heart, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely love what we share here at Wild Hearts. And while you re-at it, leave a comment. Tell me where you re-watching from, and the name of an animal that once changed your life. Thomas crouched low, lantern in one hand, coat brushing the powdery snow. The bobcat's fur was matted, flecked with splinters of bark, and she trembled, her tiny body wedged in a narrow cavity formed by the fallen tree's trunk and roots. He could smell the faint coppery tang of fear, mingled with pine sap. Every careful movement he made caused her ears to flick backward, tail stiffening like a drawn bowstring. Yet she didn't bolt, not entirely. A small chirp, more like a hiccup than a meow, escaped her throat as she shifted, testing the narrow gap, a hint of stubbornness that warmed Thomas despite the biting cold. He whispered her name softly, though he didn't know her name yet, letting the sound float through the crisp night air. The snow absorbed it, muffling it just enough that it felt intimate, meant only for the two of them. Thomas inched closer, keeping his eyes level with hers, noticing how she blinked slowly when the lantern flickered, a tiny acknowledgement of his presence. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but his focus was entirely on her, a fragile creature caught between the wild and peril, and a human who had not yet earned her trust. A branch snapped underfoot, and she tensed, ears pressed flat, but didn't bolt. Thomas swallowed, letting his pulse slow, and shifted the lantern just enough to brighten the narrow space where she huddled. There was a quirk in the way she held herself, a tiny lift of one paw as if testing the air, calculating whether this human could be trusted. In that frozen moment, Thomas felt something stir in him. A quiet ache, a tug he hadn't known he needed. He had walked through these woods countless times, seen deer, foxes, even the occasional owl, but never had he felt such a precise, urgent connection. Snowflakes began to settle on his shoulders, the cold pressing against his cheeks, and he wondered if she had been here all day, all night, alone. He imagined the tiny weight of her body shivering against the log, the way her claws had scraped at moat for bark, trying to escape, and his chest tightened. In the dim light, he saw the first flicker of movement, a tilt of her head, almost imperceptible, toward him. A flicker of hope whispered through him, soft as the falling snow. He crouched lower, careful to make himself smaller, less threatening. His hand hovered above the snow, not yet reaching, simply existing in the same space. A faint rustle of branches came from the deeper woods, wind, perhaps, or something else, and the bobcat flinched, curling her body tighter. Yet, slowly, almost impossibly, she relaxed a fraction, the stiffness in her shoulders easing, tail flicking once, twice. Thomas's heart thumped with a tender rhythm, and he realized he had stopped thinking of her as wild danger, stopped imagining how quickly she could disappear. For a heartbeat, there was only the soft mule, the gentle snow, the lantern-esque glow, and the fragile possibility of trust. He murmured again, quiet and steady, his voice a warm thread through the cold. "It's all right, I want to hurt you." And the bobcat, small and cautious, tilted her head, whiskers trembling, and chirped again. That tiny sound, half fear, half inquiry, broke something open inside him. Thomas had not expected the night to carry such precise, fragile magic. His hand itched to reach out, but he waited, knowing every inch, every second of patience mattered. The forest held its breath, and he held his own. The story was beginning, not with a rescue completed, but with the trembling first acknowledgement of one life to another. Thomas had lived alone for nearly 12 winters, long enough to feel the forest settle around him like a second skin. The cabin, a modest structure of cedar and stone, smelled of pine smoke and the faint musk of wool blankets, the hearth's warmth lingering in the corners even when the fire had died. Mornings came slow in the pines, the sun slanting through frost-heavy branches, dusting the floorboards with quiet gold. He had grown accustomed to the subtle rhythms of life here. The rustle of squirrels at mote-fev dawn, the distant call of a barred owl, the faint trail of fox prints etched in snow after a fresh storm. Loneliness had its edges softened by this constant companionship of wild things, creatures who asked nothing of him but recognition and respect. In the past, Thomas had always been drawn to the quiet, the subtle bonds one could forge without words. He had a long history of rescue work, though not always with success. A gray squirrel with a broken wing had once returned for months, favoring the sunny corner of the porch before vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. A deer had lingered at the edge of the clearing one spring, head bowed to the ground, and he had offered handfuls of oats, feeling the hum of connection in the brief, electric touch of trust. But those moments, fleeting as they were, left deep impressions. He had begun to understand the delicate alchemy required to bridge the human and the wild. Patience, humility, and an eye for the subtle signals of fear and curiosity. Yet none of that had prepared him for this winter night. The bobcat was not due another visitor at the edge of his yard. She was caught, small and vulnerable, a fragile knot of fur and fright beneath a fallen tree. The woods, usually a sanctuary, had become a trap, both for her and for his heart. He thought about the long nights he had spent alone, the kettle always perched on the stove, the chipped enamel mugs lined on the counter, and the quiet longing for something unspoken to fill the spaces of his home. Perhaps it was his own solitude that drew him to these moments, that made him recognize the sharp, trembling note of need in her mule. Thomas shifted his lantern slightly, the warm glow spilling across the snow, and his thoughts drifted back to his own childhood winters in the northern valleys, where the snow lay thick and silent, and the first tracks of a fox or rabbit were as thrilling as any storybook adventure. He remembered how his grandmother had taught him to move softly, to notice the small details, the lift of a paw, the flick of an ear, the way a creature measured the air around it. Those lessons had never left him, and now, crouched beside this trapped bobcat, they guided every motion. He was patient by instinct, but he also carried the weight of past regrets, the animals he hadn't reached in time, the ones who had slipped through his fingers. Even as he crouched in the cold, a faint smile touched his lips at the memory of a particularly bold raccoon who had once tried to steal his mittens from the line outside. Its tiny masked face, eyes wide with mischief, had mirrored some spark of daring that Thomas had loved witnessing. That memory, light and soft, countered the ache in his chest. He realized that life here was a series of careful observations and gentle interventions, each moment a choice between stepping forward or retreating, between trust and hesitation. The bobcat, still wedged beneath the log, seemed to sense his steady presence. She shifted slightly, tail flicking, eyes tracking the lantern-esque glow as he adjusted it again, trying not to cast any shadows that might startle her. Her fur, dark and flecked with winter dust, caught the light in small bursts, revealing a subtle richness beneath the layers of frost and grime. Thomas inhaled deeply, the scent of pine and damp earth, mingling with the sharper note of fear radiating from her. He felt a tightening in his chest, a familiar tug of empathy, the same sensation that had guided him through years of quiet rescues. He reflected, quietly, on the way his life had become intertwined with these moments. The cabin, the woods, even the long stretches of empty nights had become a crucible for connection. And now, with this bobcat, fragile, bright-eyed, and trapped, He felt the familiar pull of purpose sharpen into clarity. He would not turn away. He would not let the night or the snow or the ache of solitude dictate the outcome. This small, trembling creature was a challenge he could not ignore, and the bond, however tentative, had already begun to form, invisible threads stretching between human and wild, winter and warmth, fear and trust. The first moment their eyes met was a quiet collision of worlds. The Bobcat's amber gaze caught the lantern's trembling glow, round and luminous, and Thomas felt a jolt of recognition, as if some ancient chord had been struck between them. She was smaller than he'd expected, her body a delicate weave of sinew and frost-dusted fur, and the way she held herself, low to the ground, ears swiveling, tail flicking once, twice, spoke of both fear and fierce self-reliance. Thomas froze in place, noticing the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the way her whiskers twitched toward the light, and he realized this was not just a creature of the forest. She was a personality, a singular spark of life that had somehow found itself wedged in a cruel accident beneath the fallen tree. He lowered his lantern just slightly, careful to avoid casting harsh shadows across her small form. The snow pressed silently around them, muffling every sound except the occasional creak of ice in the branches overhead. She blinked slowly, a fraction longer than normal, and tilted her head just the tiniest degree, as if evaluating him. Thomas had seen this in animals before, a measure of curiosity wrapped tightly around caution, but never with a bobcat so young, so raw, so entirely herself. A faint chirp escaped her throat, startling him at first, yet he understood instantly. It was a hello, or maybe a warning, or perhaps both. He held his breath, willing the world to slow. There was a tang of cold in the air, sharp against his lungs, mingled with the faint scent of her fur, a mix of earth, winter pine, and something unspoken, wild and immediate. His gloved hand hovered midair, unextended, offering nothing but calm. She shifted slightly, pressing a paw into the snow, not to flee but to anchor herself, and Thomas felt the first tremor of connection. It was so delicate that he almost feared thinking it might be real. He remembered the raccoon who had once visited his porch, bold yet respectful, and he realized this bobcat would require a similar blend of patience and gentle courage. The lantern light played across her eyes again, catching the warmth inside the cautious amber, and Thomas whispered softly, almost involuntarily, "It's all right, I won't hurt you." His voice was low, calm, carrying no promise he could not keep. She blinked once more, the corner of her left eye catching a fraction of light like a hidden gem, and Thomas noticed the tiniest quirk, a notch in her right ear, subtle but distinctive, a mark of past brushes with the wild. It made her feel real, tangible, and fragile, a being shaped both by her own choices and by forces beyond her control. The snow around him settled in tiny spirals, drifting lazily toward the ground, and Thomas reflected on the quiet miracle of seeing her so alert, so unbroken despite her predicament. Most people would have walked by without noticing, and he felt a deep, personal gratitude that he had not. The thought made him smile faintly, though the ache of concern still pressed against his ribs. He could imagine the hours she might have spent trapped, the cold seeping into her tiny body, the isolation punctuated only by the wind whispering through broken branches. He had no illusions. She would not forgive carelessly, and she would not trust quickly. Minutes passed, each measured in infinitesimal shifts, a paw forward, a slow blink, the subtle incline of her head. Thomas crouched low, letting his coat brush the snow without stepping closer, letting the lantern hang at the perfect angle to illuminate her without startling her. He caught a fleeting movement, the curl of her tail, and smiled softly at the way it flicked with deliberate rhythm, a signal of her alertness and intelligence. He had come here to rescue, yes, but also to observe, to learn, to honor the wild precision of her being. The snow deepened, falling in soft heaps that muted the forest's distant calls, and Thomas noticed the small beat of her claws against the wood and ice, deliberate, cautious, almost musical. She was assessing him, weighing the risk of approach against the safety of stillness. And in that moment, Thomas realized that rescue was never just about freeing a body from peril. It was about creating space for trust to grow, for two worlds to inch toward one another, fragile step by step. He felt the first pulse of hope, fragile but undeniable, that she had seen him, acknowledged him, and perhaps decided that he might be safe. He exhaled slowly, a quiet breath of gratitude and tentative determination, aware that the night was still long and the forest vast, but that this first luminous meeting, eyes to eyes, heart to heart, had begun. For the first time, he felt the precise weight of responsibility and the equally precise spark of possibility, a delicate tether binding him to the amber gaze of the bobcat. The night waited, silent except for the soft fall of snow, and in that silence, Thomas promised himself he would move carefully, steadily, with patience enough to earn her trust, one small moment at a time. Earning her trust was not something that happened in a single gesture or a heartbeat. It unfolded like the slow drift of snow over the forest floor, layer upon delicate layer, each moment building on the last. Thomas understood that instinctively. He had watched countless wild creatures navigate fear, testing the limits of their world. They kept a hot caution and curiosity. He crouched near the fallen tree, keeping his movements deliberate and measured, letting the bobcat observe him rather than moving toward her. The lantern cast a gentle, steady glow, illuminating the frost on the nearby pine needles and the delicate pattern of her fur, but he kept his eyes low, speaking only in the quietest of tones. At first, she froze with every shift he made. Her tail twitched like a metronome, and Thomas noticed the subtle arching of her back, a signal he had learned to recognize as both caution and calculation. He spoke softly, barely above a whisper, letting the words float on the cold night air. "It's all right, won't met here." She blinked slowly in response, the tiniest lift of her ears, a flicker of curiosity breaking through the tension. He remained motionless, letting the moment stretch, appreciating the weight of patience. He had stopped believing that wild things would stay, and yet, in her cautious glances and measured breaths, he felt a fragile thread forming between them. The night was still and cold, punctuated only by the soft crackle of the lantern and the distant rustle of pine needles as wind brushed the branches. Thomas noticed a quirk in her behavior. Instead of keeping all four paws tucked under her, she shifted one forward tentatively, testing the air, testing him. It made him smile softly. This tiny act of inquiry was progress, a gentle signal that she was beginning to consider him not a threat but a presence worth noting. He adjusted the lantern slightly, careful to avoid startling her, and muttered an apology in the same gentle tone. Hours passed like this, measured in small movements. A flick of her ears, a blink, the slight twitch of her whiskers. Thomas crouched patiently, aware that the cold was settling into his bones, but unable to pull his focus from her. He remembered the stories of other rescues, how trust could not be rushed, how the most delicate creatures required the softest, most deliberate attention. He also recalled the chipped enamel mug he kept on the windowsill, a minor detail from earlier years, now vivid in his mind. The same careful observation, the same appreciation for subtle signals, applied to every act of connection. Eventually, she made a minuscule shift, moving one paw slightly closer to the gap between the logs. Thomas exhaled softly, recognizing the significance. It was not boldness, not surrender, but an acknowledgement, a fragile acceptance that he was present and meant no harm. He mirrored her stillness, letting the moment breathe, aware that each second of patience added another stitch to the tenuous fabric of trust between them. The snow fell quietly, blanketing the world in soft white, as if encouraging this delicate dance. At one point, a twig snapped in the distance, and the bobcat flinched, pressing herself tighter against the fallen trunk. Thomas spoke her name again, steady and calm, his voice carrying reassurance without pressure. She tilted her head, ears flicking forward and back, tail twitching once, a subtle sign of contemplation. He felt a quiet warmth in his chest, the kind that comes from witnessing the first crack in a wall of fear, a sign that the connection might yet deepen. Over the next few hours, the same pattern repeated. He would shift ever so slightly. She would observe. The tension would ease a fraction. He noted every nuance, the subtle way she sniffed the air when he adjusted the lantern, the tiny chirp that punctuated her attention, the careful lift of one paw before any movement. Each action was a small victory, each recognition a thread weaving them closer together. Thomas kept his body low, voice soft, eyes gentle, and in that deliberate presence, the bobcat began to inch towards something resembling acceptance. By the time the first faint glow of dawn touched the forest, she had moved enough that Thomas could see the delicate scar above her left eye, a mark of past trials and unknown brushes with the world beyond these woods. He reached out, not yet to touch, but to extend a silent offering of presence. Her eyes followed, amber and watchful, and he felt the fragile beginnings of trust settling between them. It was the first true breakthrough, subtle and quiet, yet profound. Two beings, human and wild, acknowledging each other in the hush of a snowy morning. The tiny breakthrough came when the bobcat, after hours of cautious observation, finally allowed a paw to brush against Thomas' glove. It was almost imperceptible at first, a hesitant touch that might have been accidental, yet he recognized it immediately. Her fur was surprisingly soft against the worn leather, damp from the melting snow, and the warmth of that small connection sent a shiver of relief through him. She flinched back instantly, as if startled by her own boldness, her tail flicking nervously, but the seed had been planted. For the first time, the barrier of fear had thinned, and Thomas felt a delicate, tender thrill, the weight of a bond beginning to form. He exhaled quietly, careful not to startle her, and murmured, "It's all right, Met here." The sound of his voice seemed to settle her, though she remained poised to retreat. Her whiskers twitched, and then another paw, this one slightly more deliberate, pressed against his glove, testing, questioning, seeking reassurance. Thomas mirrored her stillness, his hand steady and soft. He could feel her pulse through the fine fur, a rapid flutter that mirrored the beat of his own heart. In that moment he understood that trust was not given all at once. It was measured in fractions, in microbeats of courage that accumulated silently over time. The morning sun began to lift over the pines, scattering shafts of gold across the snow, and he noticed another quirk. She napped only in sunbeams, curling her small body in the narrow light that filtered between logs and branches. It was a pattern he had not anticipated, yet it spoke volumes about her character, precise, deliberate, seeking comfort in the smallest pockets of safety. He smiled softly to himself, recognizing a kind of playful intelligence in these choices. Every small behavior, every hesitant movement, added a brushstroke to the portrait of her personality. She was not just a bobcat in need. She was a being with preferences, quirks, and the quiet capacity for trust. The breakthrough, as subtle as it was, carried with it a ripple of emotion for Thomas. He had spent years observing and aiding wildlife, but rarely had he felt this intimate sense of responsibility, this fragile tether of trust. The bobcat's small paw against his glove was more than touch. It was a statement, a question, a delicate acknowledgement. Perhaps you are not a threat. Perhaps Moat can allow the world to fold around me, even if just for a moment. He pressed his hand gently into the snow for balance, feeling the cold beneath his gloves, and thought about the hours that had led to this instant. The careful patience, the restraint, the willingness to wait. A slight breeze stirred the needles overhead, carrying the earthy scent of the forest and the faint tang of winter air. The bobcat shifted closer, her movement still measured but less rigid. She chirped softly, the sound a cross between curiosity and approval, and Thomas felt an unexpected warmth bloom in his chest. He reflected on the quiet joy of witnessing these incremental victories, how profoundly the smallest gestures could resonate. Trust, he realized, was an accumulation of such moments, each one a small bridge spanning the space between fear and connection. He remembered the chipped enamel mug that sat on his kitchen windowsill, a relic from past winters, and the tiny, deliberate quirks of other animals who had wandered into his life. The raccoon who stole only the left sock, the squirrel who napped in the sunny corner, the deer who bowed its head in cautious acknowledgement. Each had left imprints on his heart, small but indelible, and now this bobcat was beginning to do the same. She was teaching him patience anew, reminding him that every life, wild or human, required careful attention and gentle respect. By mid-morning, the bobcat's stance had softened. She pressed Beote hat front paws lightly against Thomas' glove, lingering just long enough to make him laugh quietly under his breath. The sound was soft, warm, and unself-conscious, carrying the relief and wonder of a small miracle unfolding. For Thomas, this first touch was not simply a milestone in the rescue. It was a tender declaration that they were beginning to understand one another. The fragile cord of connection stretched taut, yet not uncomfortably, binding human and wild in a shared moment of trust. He allowed the paw to linger a heartbeat longer, then slowly drew his hand back, careful not to break the spell. The bobcat blinked, tail flicking in a rhythm that Thomas recognized as contentment tinged with caution. He felt a quiet, swelling pride, the kind that is not loud or boastful but deep and steady, a warm ember in the chest that glows long after the moment passes. For the first time, he dared to hope that the night's rescue could become something more than survival. It could become companionship, fragile but real, one careful touch at a time. Morning light revealed the gentle routines that would come to define their fragile companionship. The bobcat, now free from the immediate peril of the fallen tree, began to explore the edges of Thomas' cabin. Her movements cautious but increasingly deliberate. She had a preference for certain spots, as all creatures do, and Thomas quickly noted them. The sunbeam stretching across the porch floor, the curve of the stone hearth where warmth pooled in lazy golden patches, and even the chipped enamel mug he used for his morning tea. It was a minor indulgence, but one that mattered in these early days of trust, a way to learn each other's rhythms without forcing the pace. He had stopped being concerned with speed. Patience was the key, and mornings became exercises in observation. He watched her sniff at the edges of the porch, ears swiveling, tail twitching in slow arcs, and noted the quirks that made her wholly herself. She napped only in sunbeams, pressing her small body into the heat of the light while ignoring the shadows where the cold lingered. Each gesture spoke volumes. A paw lifted, a whisker quiver, a soft chirp as she navigated the world. Thomas smiled quietly to himself at these tiny acts, recognizing that trust, once earned, revealed itself in the smallest, most personal rituals. Breakfast routines emerged with a comforting regularity. Thomas would set out a small dish of warmed broth and minced meat on the edge of the porch, stepping back to allow her space. She had a meticulous way of approaching the meal, sniffing first, then tasting, then retreating a step to observe, before finally eating in deliberate bites. It was a delicate choreography, each movement a negotiation of comfort and caution. He marveled at her attentiveness, the precision of her instincts, and the way even in these small acts she taught him the art of coexistence. The mornings carried more than sustenance. They brought quiet joy. Thomas noted the subtle humor in her actions, the way she sometimes stole only the left sock from his laundry pile, dropping it with satisfaction elsewhere, as if marking her domain, or the soft chirp she emitted when startled by a drifting snowflake. These idiosyncrasies made her endearing, and he felt a warm, gentle laughter rise within him, the kind that comes from deep affection rather than frivolity. He had long believed that the wild remained forever apart from human warmth. And yet here she was, a bridge between solitude and companionship, teaching him that connection could emerge in the quietest ways. There were moments, too, of introspection. He would sit by the hearth, the kettle hissing softly in the background, watching her settle into a sunbeam or stretch delicately across the porch floor. The bobcat's cautious confidence reminded him of the delicate balance between freedom and safety, between curiosity and restraint. He reflected on his own life. the years of quiet solitude, the patient observation of the forest and its inhabitants, and felt a growing sense of purpose. The act of care was not merely about survival. It was about fostering trust, about allowing a wild heart to know security without compromising its essence. Thomas had his own rituals that complemented hers. He would fill the enamel mug kepi te hat hot water for tea, sit on the step, and let the bobcat watch, sometimes approach, sometimes retreat. The small, deliberate acts, the tilt of his head, the soft tone of his voice, the careful placement of food, became a shared language. She learned his habits as he learned hers. When he hummed softly, she listened. When he paused in his movements, she mirrored stillness. They were forming a rhythm together, a daily dance of patience, respect, and silent companionship, each step reinforcing the fragile bond that had begun with a single paw against a glove. By mid-morning, the forest outside the cabin glowed with soft light, snowflakes drifting lazily from the pines. The bobcat explored further, venturing to the edges of the clearing, then returning, always keeping one eye on him. Thomas felt a quiet contentment settle in his chest, a sense of stability in the gentle routines they were building. He knew that the wild heart beside him was still independent, still cautious, but also present, willing to share space and time, if only slowly. It was a tentative harmony, fragile yet steadfast, the kind of quiet companionship that warms the spirit without demanding it. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas reflected on the miraculous simplicity of these shared moments. The soft warmth of the hearth, the faint tang of pine in the air, the subtle quirk of a paw or a chirp, all of it was a testament to patience, empathy, and trust earned over hours, days, and perhaps, if careful, weeks. Each routine, no matter how small, reinforced the connection between human and wild. The bobcat, once trapped and trembling beneath the fallen tree, was now exploring her surroundings with measured confidence, and Thomas felt a swell of gentle pride. The rescue had not ended with her release. It had only begun in the slow, luminous unfolding of daily life together. Days passed with a gentle rhythm, and quiet joy settled into the spaces of Thomas' cabin, like sunlight through frosted windows. The bobcat began revealing the smaller details of her personality, subtle quirks that made each moment shared between them feel intimate and entirely new. She chirped occasionally, instead of meowing, a sharp, high-pitched sound that made Thomas chuckle softly, even as he reminded himself to keep his movements slow and deliberate. Sometimes she would dash after a drifting leaf across the porch, only to abandon it halfway, seemingly judging the chase less satisfying than the warmth of a sunny patch. In these moments, Thomas felt an unexpected lightness, as if the weight of long winters and solitary evenings had softened, kept hot, each tiny display of her playful curiosity. One morning, as frost clung to the tips of the pines, Thomas noticed a behavior that made him smile even more. The bobcat had a peculiar habit of stealing only the left sock from his laundry pile. She would carry it a few feet before dropping it on the snow, staring back with cautious pride, and then retreating into the shadows of the porch. It was a ritual, he realized, a small assertion of agency that marked the borders of her newfound comfort. Thomas laughed quietly, the sound carrying warmth across the crisp air, and for a fleeting moment he imagined that the bobcat had a sense of humor, a private delight in her little mischiefs. The simplicity of Et Shehat acts grounded him, reminding him that trust could be playful as well as tender. The forest itself seemed to respond to this slow unfolding of companionship. Sunlight filtered through the branches, scattering patches of gold on the snow, and the bobcat would pause, tilting her head to watch the light shift across her fur. She began venturing slightly farther from the porch during the day, though always returning with careful deliberation, her tail flicking kepi hot, alertness and curiosity. Thomas noticed the subtle changes, the way her ears swiveled to capture distant sounds, the small but deliberate steps she took over uneven ground, and the soft rumble in her throat when he hummed or murmured reassuring words. Each observation was a gentle revelation, evidence that patience and steady presence could coax the wild toward intimacy without pressure. Evenings became sacred for both of them. The cabin's hearth crackled softly, the warm scent of pine smoke filling the room, while the bobcat would stretch languidly on the floorboards, curling into a sunbeam that persisted in its evening incarnation. Thomas would sit nearby, sipping tea from the chipped enamel mug that had been a silent witness to so many small victories, and watch her eyes track shadows and drifting snowflakes. She had a rhythm now, a deliberate pacing that balanced exploration with cautious retreat. The sight of her settling into these routines brought Thomas a quiet, profound sense of fulfillment. He understood that the rescue was no longer about immediate survival, but about nurturing a fragile, enduring connection that could blossom only in trust and time. Thomas reflected often on these small joys. He had lived years among the forest and its inhabitants, but rarely had he felt such a tender tether to one creature. The bobcat's quirks, the chirps, the stolen lowy eptaisock, the sunbeam naps, were markers of comfort and familiarity, and each one reinforced the bridge between human and wild. In the warmth of these shared routines, he recognized something more than companionship, a mutual understanding, an unspoken agreement that the cabin and the woods could be a shared space where fear and caution softened into curiosity and affection. One late afternoon, as the sky deepened to a muted rose and the first hints of twilight touched the pines, Thomas witnessed another subtle gesture that filled him with warmth. The bobcat approached slowly, pausing just beyond the porch, and brushed her small head against his knee before darting back to a sunlit patch. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it carried immense weight. He knelt slowly, careful not to startle her, and murmured softly, "Mote see you, mote understand." She blinked, ears flicking, tail curling once twice, and settled into the light. The trust was no longer tentative. It was woven into the quiet fabric of their days, expressed through shared space, gentle gestures, and the tender acknowledgement of one another's presence. Through these daily discoveries, Thomas felt a grounding joy that softened the ache of past solitude. Each morning, each evening, each careful observation reminded him that the wild heart he had rescued was choosing him in small, deliberate ways. He had not simply freed her from a fallen tree. He had opened a window into a shared life, delicate and luminous, in which laughter, curiosity, and gentle affection could coexist with the vastness and unpredictability of the forest. And in these soft moments, he allowed himself to imagine the life they would continue to build, brick by invisible brick, in trust, patience, and quiet joy. Even in the midst of quiet joy, Thomas could not ignore the subtle warning signs. At first, they were nearly imperceptible. A slight hesitation when the bobcat leapt across a log, a pause in her steps before approaching the porch, a brief favoring of her right side. He noticed how she sometimes lingered longer in sunbeams, shifting her weight as if protecting something unseen, and a chill ran down his spine. These were not dramatic injuries or emergencies, but delicate signals from the wild heart beside him, hints that the fragile trust they had built might be challenged by unseen vulnerabilities. He had learned to read these whispers of unease over years in the forest, and now every small gesture demanded his full attention. One morning, as the frost glittered like scattered crystals on the pine needles, Thomas saw the subtle limp in her step. She moved cautiously, paw pressing lightly, tail flicking in brief arcs, and he felt a pang of worry that cut deeper than the cold. His hands itched to reach out, but he remembered the slow, deliberate patience that had brought her trust this far. Instead, he watched, letting her navigate the terrain on her own, noting every adjustment, every measured step. It was a delicate dance between intervention and respect, and Thomas knew that the forest had its own rhythms. Rhythms he could observe but never control. The bobcat's keen awareness of her surroundings heightened, every sound in the snowy woods amplified in her ears. Twigs snapped under distant wildlife, snow shifted from heavy branches, and she paused at each disturbance, head tilting, ears swiveling like radar dishes. her amber eyes wide and alert. She was cautious now in ways he had not seen before, and Thomas felt a quiet ache in his chest. He had hoped for a seamless transition into trust and comfort, but the subtle shifts in her behavior reminded him that wild hearts carry their own histories, their own fragility, and their own unpredictable responses to perceived danger. Still, there were moments of reassurance. When Thomas hummed softly while tending to the hearth or adjusting the chipped enamel mug, she would pause, whiskers twitching, tail curling around her small body, and he would feel the brief return of their connection. It was a fragile tether, easily frayed, but present nonetheless. He reflected on the fact that even in these warning signs, there was no loss, only a reminder that the wild could not be fully domesticated, that patience and observation remained paramount. Trust was never guaranteed, and he had learned to hold both hope and vigilance in equal measure. The morning air carried a crisp scent of pine and damp snow, and Thomas noted another subtle quirk. When the bobcat's paw hurt slightly, she would shift her weight with precise calculation, avoiding uneven surfaces, yet still venture toward him, keeping just enough distance to feel safe. That small decision, to approach despite discomfort, was a testament to the bond they had formed. It reminded him that trust once earned is resilient, but it requires continual reinforcement through careful, gentle actions. Even a limp could not erase the delicate choreography of connection they had built over days and nights. He spent hours observing her, offering reassurance without pressing, speaking in low murmurs, keeping his own movements deliberate. Each step she took, each careful paw placement, became a lesson in respect and attentiveness. He realized that these warning signs were not setbacks, but invitations. Invitations to deepen his understanding, to strengthen the fragile bridge between human and wild, and to honor the subtle rhythms of her body and spirit. His heart, already tender from the slow emergence of trust, expanded with a quiet determination to meet her where she was, in every tiny nuance. By afternoon, Thomas could see the balance returning. The Bobcat's movements were still cautious, but she had regained a measure of confidence. She ventured closer to the porch, pausing in sunbeams, flicking her tail in brief, deliberate sweeps, and chirping softly when he hummed. He knelt low, keeping his eyes level. They kept hat hers, and felt the same delicate warmth he had in the earliest days of their acquaintance. These subtle warning signs had not broken the bond. They had strengthened it, reinforcing the need for attentiveness, patience, and the unwavering respect for a wild heart learning to trust again. And so, as the sun dipped behind the pines, casting long, soft shadows across the snow, Thomas reflected quietly. The forest, the cabin, the falling snow, and the bobcat herself were part of an intricate ecosystem of care, vigilance, and affection. He knew that danger could always arise, that vulnerability was a constant companion, but he also understood that these small shifts, these warning signs, were the language of the wild, a language he was learning to read with compassion, patience, and the gentle joy that had carried them this far. The morning she disappeared arrived like fog rolling across the forest, thick and unyielding, softening the world into muted shapes and shadows. Thomas awoke to an empty porch, the soft indentations of snow, where she had curled the night before now undisturbed, smooth and untouched. His heart lurched, a hollow ache spreading through his chest, and he scanned the edge of the forest, eyes straining through the mist. The amber gaze that had met his so steadily in the past hours, days, and weeks was gone, replaced by the stark absence of her presence. He felt the sharp, cold tug of fear, the kind that twists into every quiet thought when a trusted life vanishes without a trace. The first instinct was denial. He called her name softly, a whisper carried over snow and pines. "Little one, come back." The sound seemed to dissolve into the mist, answered only by the faint whistle of the wind and the distant, muffled crunch of ice under his boots. He followed the faint paw prints she had left yesterday, noticing the subtle flattening of snow where her weight had pressed, the scattering of pine needles in her wake, And then the trail ended abruptly. She was gone. Thomas sank to his knees in the cold, pressing a hand into the powdery snow, feeling its icy bite, but unable to pull himself away from the evidence of her absence. Every instinct screamed that she might be hurt, trapped again, or worse, that she had wandered too far and would not return. The ache in his chest grew heavier with each passing minute, pressing into him like the dense fog around the trees. He imagined her small amber eyes blinking in fear, the soft tremor of her paws against the earth, and a profound grief welled up inside him. He had prepared for patient observation, for slow progress, for cautious trust, but he had not prepared for this sudden void. The world felt unbalanced, hollowed by the missing weight of her presence. Thomas ventured deeper into the fog, boots crunching softly over snow and fallen branches, calling her name at intervals. Each sound echoed strangely, swallowed by the muted world, and the bobcat's absence pressed against him with a quiet intensity. He searched familiar clearings, the edges of the porch, the sunlit patches where she loved to nap, and even the tangled roots near the old maple at the forest's edge. Nothing, not a flicker of movement, not a chirp, not a rustle of fur in the underbrush. His chest ached with the weight of uncertainty, each step feeling heavier than the last. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to hold its breath. He paused at the base of a fallen pine, imagining her small body pressed against the rough bark, favoring one paw, ears swiveling at the faintest sound. He remembered the way she had learned to trust him, the tender moments of sunbeam naps, stolen left socks and soft chirps in response to his humming. Each memory now carried the bittersweet weight of loss. Thomas felt a deep, quiet heartbreak, the kind that settles into the bones. Persistent and insistent, he had saved her once, had nurtured the fragile bond of trust, and now that bond felt suspended in the mist, intangible, almost as if it had never existed. He considered the forest paths she might have taken, the hidden dens, the crumbling logs, the frost-crusted underbrush. Every shadow seemed suspect, every sound amplified in his awareness. Thomas moved slowly, intentionally, but the fog swallowed him, and with it, the certainty of finding her. He paused often, calling her name, listening for the faintest hint of her chirp, remembering her quirks, the paw lifts, the careful steps, the tilt of her head, and imagining them now as markers leading him through the mist. But still, nothing appeared. Hours passed. The sun remained veiled, filtered into dim gray. Thomas finally sank to a fallen log, exhaustion mingling with dread. He rested his hands on the snow, pressing into the cold as if it could ground him, but the emptiness persisted. He reflected on the fragility of their connection, the delicate trust they had built, and how quickly it could feel severed, even if temporarily. The forest had claimed her presence, and for now, all he could do was wait, watch, and hope against the gnawing ache that had lodged itself in his chest. The fog thickened as twilight approached, casting long, diffused shadows across the snow. Thomas remained near the edge of the clearing, scanning each tree, each mound of snow, each hollowed root. He imagined the tiny warmth of her body curled against the cold earth, the faint chirp she might make in recognition of him. And though the heartbreak pressed down, he knew that the bond they had formed, fragile, patient, and tender, was not entirely lost. Somewhere out there, the bobcat was alive, and the hope of her return, however tentative, was the only thread he could cling to as the first stars began to blink in the winter sky. Thomas searched the forest with a quiet desperation, each step through the snow-laden pines echoing the ache in his chest. The fog hung heavy, softening shapes into ghostly silhouettes, and every rustle of a branch, every distant snap of ice underfoot made his pulse quicken. He called her name again, his voice low and steady, carrying over the hollowed white expanse. But the bobcat did not answer. He followed paw prints left the day before, tracing them over frozen soil and underbrush, only to find them disappearing abruptly into a tangle of roots and brambles. With every vanished track, his heart sank a little deeper, the hollow ache growing into a dull, persistent weight. Hours passed in a rhythm of hope and despair. He paused at familiar clearings, scanning the shadows and drifts for any sign of her amber eyes. The memory of her chirp, the tiny quirks of her behavior, the way she stole the left sock, the sunbeam naps, played on a loop in his mind, each image sharper in its absence. He felt the fragile tether of trust they had built, stretching thin, threatened by distance and uncertainty. Thomas had not expected heartbreak like this, the kind that seeps quietly into your chest, folding every thought around the empty space where she should have been. The forest seemed Bobcat, alive and unyielding. The wind whispered through the pines, scattering flakes of snow like delicate sparks, and he imagined her small body huddled beneath some hidden shelter, ears pressed back, muscles taut with alertness. He thought about how she had moved with deliberate care, every paw placement intentional, every blink and tilt of her head a signal of thought. Now, in her absence, he felt the gravity of that intelligence, the weight of a life so keenly aware of its surroundings, slipping out of reach. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat and pressed onward, calling again, listening for the faintest chirp, the softest rustle of movement. As twilight approached, shadows deepened, and the fog thickened, folding the world into muted gray. Thomas's boots sank into drifts, his breath steaming in clouds that vanished almost immediately into the chill. He stumbled upon a small depression in the snow, a possible resting place, but it was empty. Each empty space, each vanished trace, felt like a personal failure. He had been there to guide her, to nurture the fragile beginnings of trust. And now, faced with her disappearance, he questioned whether patience and care could withstand the unpredictability of the wild. The weight of helplessness pressed down on him, like the heavy, snow-laden branches overhead. Night began to settle, and the forest's shape blurred into indistinct contours. Thomas lit a small lantern and held it high, the flickering glow casting long, wavering shadows across the snow. He called her name once more, the sound, low and desperate, carrying into the quiet that seemed to stretch endlessly. Each distant echo of his voice reminded him of the bond they had forged in days past, the trust that had been so delicately earned, and he clung to the faint hope that it was not entirely broken. Somewhere, he told himself, she would hear it. Somewhere, she might recognize the human presence as familiar, a tether back to safety. Hours melded into a blur of searching and calling, Thomas moving slowly, every sense alert to the forest's subtle language. He noted paw prints that were not hers, small disturbances in the snow, the faint flick of a tail behind a distant bush, but each turned out to be someone else's passage, reminders of the world continuing in parallel to his grief. The heartbreak pressed quietly, a steady ache under the ribs, and he thought of all the fragile lives he had touched in years past, of the trust that had been gained and sometimes lost. This absence felt sharper because of the bond they had built so delicately. By midnight, Thomas returned to the cabin briefly, exhausted and chilled, but he could not bring himself to retreat fully. He brewed a small pot of tea, carrying the lantern to the edge of the porch, where the snow glimmered under its golden glow. He sipped slowly, each swallow grounding him, while scanning the forest beyond. He whispered her name softly into the night, a prayer and a hope entwined, and waited. Even in despair, he refused to let go of the bond they had begun to form. The ache in his chest remained, but so did a fragile thread of hope, a conviction that a wild heart, trusted, might yet find its way back to him. Weeks passed, each day folding into the next, with the quiet rhythm of snow falling and thawing, and Thomas began to fear that he might never see her again. His searches stretched further into the woods, through tangled underbrush, and along frozen streams, eyes scanning for the faintest glimmer of amber, or the delicate shape of a paw print. Each time he paused, listening for her soft chirps, or the rustle of movement, the forest remained silent, indifferent. His heart carried a hollow ache, each echo of the snow-laden pines, reinforcing the possibility that the bobcat had vanished completely from his life. And yet, hope persisted. Thomas Canoave kept too well the resilience of wild hearts, the way instinct and familiarity could guide a creature back to safety. He held on to the memory of their first touch, the cautious paw against his glove, the sunbeam naps, the left sock heist, tiny moments that had tethered them together. On a late afternoon, the sun dipped low behind the trees, spilling muted gold across the snow when he spotted her. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, a shadow caught in the branches. But then the familiar amber eyes met his, wide and wary, and recognition flooded him like a sudden thaw. She was thinner than he remembered, favoring one side as she limped toward him cautiously, tail flicking in measured arcs, ears swiveling at the smallest sound. The sight broke through the weeks of worry and dread, and Thomas felt relief wash over him in a tremulous wave. He knelt slowly, careful not to startle her, voice soft and steady. "You back, you made it." She paused, blinking slowly, the small notch in her right ear catching the last rays of sunlight, and chirped softly, a tiny, deliberate sound that confirmed what his heart had longed for. She remembered him. The reunion was careful, deliberate, and tender. She approached in small steps, testing the space between them, tail curling around her body, paws pressing lightly into the snow. Thomas remained still, allowing her the choice of proximity, observing the subtle quivers of her whiskers, the careful lift of a hat paw, the faint tilt of her head. In those moments, he realized that trust, once shaken by absence, could be rebuilt through patience and steady presence. Every cautious movement, every flick of her tail, became an affirmation of resilience, of connection surviving despite weeks apart. He offered her the warmth of his coat, kneeling low so as not to loom, and she brushed lightly against him, fur soft and slightly damp, favoring her injured side. He murmured reassurances, feeling the pulse of life through her small body, the steady rhythm of breath and cautious recognition. The Bobcat's return was not immediate surrender, but a gradual acceptance, a delicate acknowledgement that this human, this presence, could be trusted once again. He marveled at her intelligence, her memory, the way she navigated the delicate balance between caution and comfort. Evening settled over the pines, and Thomas guided her gently toward the porch. Snowflakes drifted softly, landing on her fur and the edges of the cabin, creating a quiet hush. She paused at the sunlit patches, curling briefly to warm herself, then met his eyes again. Amber meeting amber, in a moment of mutual understanding. The weeks of separation had etched their own marks, slight limps, thinner fur, a cautious glance, yet the thread of connection endured, delicate but unbroken. Thomas felt a swell of gratitude, a quiet relief that surpassed words, and whispered, "You rehome." That night, as he lit the lantern and carried a small dish of warmed broth, she ate in deliberate, careful bites, glancing frequently toward him. The trust that had been interrupted by her absence began to weave itself anew, reinforced by the tender ritual of presence and patience. Thomas observed every nuance, the tilt of her ears, the flick of her tail, the soft chirps she emitted as if marking the moment, and felt a profound quiet joy. She was back, alive, aware, and willing to re-engage with the bond they had forged. For the first time in weeks, Thomas allowed himself to relax, settling on the porch step with the lantern casting a soft glow across the snow. He watched her curl in a sunbeam that persisted even in the early twilight, fur brushing lightly against the warm light, and thought about the weeks of searching, the ache of absence, and the fragile miracle of return. The heartbreak had not erased the connection. If anything, it had strengthened it, infusing every gesture with renewed tenderness and meaning. The Bobcat's eyes, wide and attentive, met his once more, and Thomas knew with a quiet certainty that some wild hearts once trusted never truly leave. Healing was not immediate, nor was it linear. The Bobcat, now back in the fold of Thomas' care, moved with a measured caution that spoke of her recent trials. She favored her side slightly, pressing paws lightly into snow and porch boards, and Thomas observed every nuance with a careful attentiveness. Each step she took was a negotiation with her own body, a negotiation with trust, and a negotiation with the memory of her disappearance. Yet, as days passed, subtle signs of recovery emerged. A stretch of her legs in sunlit patches, a cautious dash to chase a drifting leaf, a soft, satisfied chirp after a meal. Healing, he realized, was a rhythm as delicate as trust itself. Thomas adjusted his routine to accommodate her careful movements. He placed food in shallow dishes, warmed the broth slightly, and cleared snow from the sunniest patches on the porch. The chipped enamel mug he used for tea became a silent marker of continuity and care, a small object in a world of uncertainty that reminded both of them of the rituals that grounded them. She responded in small ways, brushing closer during mornings, circling near his boots at night, tail flicking once, twice, signaling attention and acknowledgement. Each subtle gesture marked progress, a testament to the resilience of a wild heart, nurtured in patience and gentle observation. In the quiet mornings, Thomas would kneel on the porch, lantern beside him, and hum softly as she explored the edges of her familiar world. Her amber eyes tracked his movements, but now with a gentleness that had been absent in the first days after her return. She would pause, whiskers twitching, head tilting, then move a fraction closer, a tentative negotiation of space that spoke volumes. Thomas felt a swell of quiet pride, a grounding warmth in the chest, as if the weeks of fear, absence, and searching had forged a bond stronger than before. Every soft paw step, every measured pause, was a silent conversation, and he listened with all of his attention. She began to regain strength, limping less, stepping more confidently across the porch, and occasionally leaping to the low rail with practiced agility. Thomas marveled at her determination, the intelligence in her movements, and the subtle playfulness returning to her gestures. The small chirps, once cautious and tentative, grew more frequent, interspersed with moments of curiosity and mild mischief. She would swipe gently at a falling pine needle, or observe the swirl of snowflakes, whiskers twitching, ears alert. The rhythm of daily life, breakfast, exploration, sunbeam naps, evening warmth, became a framework for recovery, and Thomas witnessed her confidence blossoming, step by careful step. In these days of healing, Thomas found his own heart mending alongside hers. The sharp edges of anxiety and fear from her disappearance softened, replaced by a deep, steady comfort. The bond they shared, once fragile and easily threatened, now had room to breathe and expand. He noticed the subtleties in her behavior, the way she circled before resting, the slight flick of her tail in anticipation of his presence, the small chirp as she watched him brew tea. Each gesture carried reassurance, a quiet affirmation that they were rebuilding together. The forest around the cabin seemed to mirror this healing. Snow melted gradually under the sun, droplets glinting like tiny jewels, and the air carried the faint tang of pine resin and warming earth. Thomas reflected on the resilience required to care for a wild heart, the patience to allow movement at its ove kept no pace, the attentiveness to small shifts in behavior, and the acceptance of moments of vulnerability. Healing was not merely physical. It was emotional, delicate, and mutual. Each day he felt a deep gratitude for the tender exchanges, for the trust renewed, and for the quiet joy of witnessing her strength returning. By twilight, she would settle near the hearth, paws tucked under, tail flicking lazily as he adjusted the lantern and brewed tea. Her amber eyes met his with a soft recognition, and Thomas allowed himself to exhale fully, the tension of the weeks of absence and uncertainty slowly dissolving. In her gradual recovery, he saw the proof of their connection. Patient care, gentle attention, and unwavering presence could mend not just a body, but the fragile threads of trust that tied them together. In that soft glow of lantern and hearth, the bond between human and wild heart became palpable, resilient, and quietly unshakable. It began with the soft rustle of movement at the edge of the porch, a subtle disturbance in the snow that Thomas almost didn't notice. At first, he thought it might be the wind or a drifting pine cone, but then a small, masked face emerged from the underbrush, a curious raccoon, drawn by the warmth and scents of the cabin. The bobcat froze instantly, tail flicking in measured arcs, ears pressed flat against her head. She had always been cautious, but this newcomer tested the boundaries of her world. Thomas watched quietly, careful not to intervene, allowing the two wild hearts to negotiate their own terms of coexistence. The raccoon sniffed tentatively, paws brushing against the snow, observing the bobcat with keen intelligence. There was a pause, a delicate standoff, and then, slowly, the bobcat relaxed just enough for Thomas to breathe a quiet sigh of relief. Her tail flicked once, twice, signaling attention but not aggression. The raccoon, sensing the tentative acceptance, inched closer, circling the porch in a cautious exploration. It was a subtle dance, measured and deliberate, a negotiation of trust that mirrored the delicate steps Thomas had taken with the bobcat weeks before. In these moments he felt an almost reverent awe at the intricate intelligence of wild hearts. Over the next few days, the raccoon returned consistently. At first, the bobcat observed from a distance, amber eyes tracking the newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She had been fiercely independent, cautious in every movement, yet there was something in the raccoon's quiet persistence that intrigued her. Thomas noticed a subtle softening in her behavior, the slightest easing of tension in her posture when the raccoon lingered nearby. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but for him it signaled the expansion of her trust, not just toward humans, but toward another creature entirely. The trio's interactions were a study in patience and negotiation. The raccoon was mischievous, exploring the edges of the porch, sniffing the bowls of warmed broth, and occasionally attempting to swipe a leftover morsel. The bobcat responded with measured swipes of her own, not in aggression but in playful assertion of boundaries. Each encounter was brief, deliberate, and filled with tiny cues. A flick of a tail, a subtle chirp, a cautious approach followed by retreat. Thomas observed every nuance, marveling at the intelligence and adaptability of both creatures. The bond that had begun, with her trust in him, now extended to the careful negotiation of a new social dynamic. Evenings became a tableau of gentle companionship. Thomas would sit on the porch, lantern casting soft light across the snow, watching the bobcat and raccoon explore the edges of their shared space. The bobcat began to approach the raccoon with small tentative steps, sniffing and circling, tail flicking in careful arcs. The raccoon responded with measured curiosity, paws lifting delicately as it explored the territory. Thomas hummed softly, and the bobcat paused to listen, ears swiveling, whiskers twitching. It was a tender choreography, a silent understanding forming between the two wild hearts, and he felt a swell of quiet joy at witnessing the emergence of their connection. The addition of a new family member subtly reshaped the rhythms of daily life. Meals became shared affairs, though always with space for autonomy. The bobcat would take her portion first, the raccoon would wait, observing, before finally sampling its share. Thomas noted how the bobcat's confidence had grown. She no longer hid at the edges of the porch, but engaged with her surroundings, even with another animal present. Her amber eyes glimmered with curiosity and intelligence, a reflection of both past caution and present resilience. The small routines that had defined their mornings and evenings now expanded to include an entirely new dynamic, enriching the delicate ecosystem of trust and care. By twilight, the raccoon would settle a respectful distance from the bobcat, who in turn curled in a sunbeam on the porch, amber eyes scanning the forest edge with alert curiosity. Thomas adjusted the lantern, brewed a small pot of tea, and observed the quiet tableau, a sense of profound gratitude settling in his chest. These wild hearts, once wary and independent, were learning to coexist, their tentative trust forming the foundation of a fragile, enduring companionship. In the soft glow of lantern and hearth, Thomas recognized the subtle beauty of connection, the quiet triumph of patience, and the extraordinary possibility of love extending beyond species, resilient and luminous, in the shared space of snow, forest, and home. Life around the cabin settled into a gentle rhythm that carried the soft weight of familiarity. Evenings softened into muted light, the lantern flickering across snow-dusted boards, casting long, warm shadows. The bobcat and raccoon had grown accustomed to one another's presence, negotiating space with subtle gestures, a flick of a tail, a gentle sniff, a measured paw step, while Thomas moved quietly among them, an attentive participant rather than a guide. The routines of meals, sunbeam naps, and the quiet hum of his voice created a tapestry of trust and companionship, each thread reinforcing the delicate harmony of the small, wild family he had helped nurture. The porch became a sanctuary for them all. The bobcat curled into the warm glow of the sun in the late afternoon, whiskers twitching as she observed the raccoon exploring the edges of the snow. She no longer needed to maintain a constant state of vigilance. Her body relaxed, muscles easing, the limp she had favored gradually fading into fluid steps. Thomas watched from the porch step, tea in hand, listening to the soft chirps and gentle rustles, feeling the precise hum of contentment that comes when life unfolds gently and deliberately. It was a rhythm born of patience, care, and the tender persistence of trust. At night the cabin glowed from within, a beacon in the forest. Quiet darkness. Snow fell lightly, drifting onto the porch and surrounding trees, blanketing the world in soft white. The bobcat would settle near the hearth, fur brushing against warm light, while the raccoon lingered at a respectful distance, nose twitching, ears alert. Thomas hummed softly, a gentle cadence that the bobcat had come to recognize, and she would blink slowly in acknowledgement. These small rituals, repeated daily, formed a comforting predictability, a shared language of presence and security that transcended species. The wildness of their lives remained intact, even as trust deepened. The bobcat chased drifting leaves across the porch, sometimes engaging the raccoon in short bursts of playful interaction. Their movements were deliberate, measured, and filled with subtle cues that spoke volumes to each other and to Thomas. He marveled at the intelligence of Bobcat hot creatures, the delicate negotiations, the quiet boundaries maintained with mutual respect. The world outside remained unpredictable and vast, yet within the soft glow of lantern and hearth, a small, luminous order had emerged, grounded in patience and tender attention. Thomas reflected quietly on the journey that had brought them here. From the first night beneath the fallen tree, through weeks of cautious patience, heartbreak, and eventual reunion, to the introduction of a new companion, every step had been a lesson in empathy, vigilance, and trust. He thought of the subtle signs, the flick of a tail, the soft chirp, the stolen left sock, that had revealed personality, intelligence, and the capacity for connection. In these small details lay the profound reminder that wild hearts, though wary and fiercely independent, could choose to engage, and that such choices carried immense meaning for those willing to observe, honor, and wait. The snow continued to fall outside, delicate crystals glinting in the lantern light, while inside the cabin, warmth and quiet companionship held sway. Thomas poured himself a cup of tea, the aroma of pine smoke mingling with the faint, sweet scent of the hearth, and watched as the bobcat shifted into a comfortable curl, amber eyes meeting his vacep, ite hot recognition and contentment. The raccoon, curious but respectful, sniffed at the edges of the porch before settling into a soft mound of fur and warmth nearby. In this scene, Thomas saw the culmination of trust, patience, and care. A wild heart healed, another accepted, and a home quietly transformed into a space of gentle, enduring connection. Even as night deepened and shadows stretched long across the snow, the rhythm of life continued. The porch light glowed steadily, the soft hum of the kettle punctuating the quiet, and the small figures of bobcat and raccoon moved in harmony, guided by instinct, experience, and the shared space Thomas had nurtured. Settled life, he realized, was not the absence of uncertainty or the erasure of past trials, but the patient unfolding of daily routines, the careful observation of subtle gestures, and the enduring presence of trust, resilience, and quiet affection. Thomas often found himself sitting quietly on the porch as the sun dipped low, the sky a muted palette of pink and gray, watching the bobcat and raccoon move through their small, shared world. He reflected on the long journey they had traversed together. From the night she had been trapped beneath the fallen tree, to the tentative trust of first touches, through the heartbreak of her disappearance, and finally, to the healing and companionship that now defined their lives. Each day had been a careful negotiation, a delicate choreography of patience, observation, and empathy, and now the rhythm of settled life had become a source of profound, quiet joy. The bobcat stretched gracefully in a patch of fading sunlight, amber eyes glimmering with curiosity and intelligence, her tail curling in subtle arcs as she observed the raccoon exploring nearby. The raccoon, in turn, moved with a careful, respectful distance, sniffing, circling, and occasionally tapping at the snow, as if testing boundaries that had been gently established over weeks. Thomas felt a swell of warmth in his chest as he noted their quiet interactions. A shared understanding had formed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of space, respect, and gentle affection. These creatures, once wary and cautious, had carved a tender world together under his watchful care. He reflected on the lessons embedded in their journey. Patience, he realized, had been the most profound teacher. Trust could not be rushed, nor could it be demanded. It was earned in tiny increments, in small gestures, and in the attentive observation of subtle cues. The bobcat's quirks, chirps instead of mews, napping only in sunbeams, the playful theft of a left sock, had revealed not only her personality, but the very nature of the bond he had nurtured. Through her, Thomas had come to understand the delicate balance between freedom and connection, independence and intimacy, fear and trust. The forest surrounding the cabin exhaled a quiet peace, the pines swaying gently in the evening breeze, the snow glinting in the last light of day. Thomas inhaled deeply, the familiar scents of pine, earth, and hearth mingling in a soothing embrace. The porch light glowed steadily, illuminating the bobcat's sleek form curled near the steps, and the raccoon resting close by. In this soft tableau, he recognized the enduring power of care and empathy, the miracle of trust painstakingly built, and the quiet beauty of lives intertwined, however tentatively, across species and circumstance. Even in moments of reflection, Thomas found himself smiling softly at the delicate humor and tenderness that had emerged in their shared lives. The bobcat's occasional chirps, the raccoon's careful exploration, the small rituals of meals and sunbeam naps, the rhythm of presence and observation that had become their unspoken language. He understood that these moments, fragile and fleeting as they sometimes were, carried the weight of profound connection. They reminded him that some wild hearts, once touched by patience and care, never truly leave, even if they wander temporarily, even if they test the limits of trust. As twilight deepened, Thomas leaned back on the porch step, letting the quiet of the evening settle around him. The bobcat's amber eyes met his one last time before she nestled into the warmth of a sunbeam still lingering in the snow, and the raccoon curled nearby, content and at ease. He felt a profound sense of completion, a soft exhale of gratitude for the journey that had unfolded. Heartbreak, hope, patience, and the tender emergence of trust and companionship. Their world was small but luminous, grounded in care, observation, and shared presence. He thought of all the winters he had spent alone, the lessons learned from foxes, squirrels, and deer, and the deep joy of bearing witness to a wild heart healing and choosing to stay. The cabin, the porch, the snow, and the gentle forest beyond had become the backdrop to a story of resilience and quiet miracles. And as the night drew on, the lantern casting its warm glow across the clearing, Thomas allowed himself to simply exist in this fragile, luminous moment, surrounded by the wild hearts who had chosen him as much as he had chosen them. Snowflakes drifted softly around the porch, settling on the edges of the steps, and the thin layer of frost across the cabin roof. The lantern glowed steadily, a warm, golden halo that cut through the winter gloom. The bobcat lay curled near Thomas's feet, amber eyes blinking slowly, tail twitching once in contentment, while the raccoon rested a few paces away, ears alert but body relaxed. The forest beyond stretched into quiet, soft shadows, pines swaying gently, snow muffling all sound but the occasional distant creak of ice-laden branches. The world seemed paused, holding its breath in recognition of the fragile trust and quiet companionship that had taken root. Thomas exhaled slowly, leaning back against the porch railing, letting the warmth of the lantern and the hearth seep into his bones. He thought of the journey they had shared, the trembling mule beneath the fallen tree, the cautious first paw against a glove, the heartbreak of her disappearance, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust and confidence. Each moment, each small gesture, each chirp and quirk had carried weight, had stitched together the fragile tapestry of connection between human and wild hearts. And though the world beyond the forest remained vast, unpredictable and often indifferent, this small patch of snow and light was theirs. The porch, the cabin, and the forest had become more than shelter. They were a stage for tenderness, patience, and enduring bonds. Thomas watched the bobcat's chest rise and fall, the raccoon's subtle movements, and allowed himself a quiet gratitude. The bond, once delicate and uncertain, had grown resilient, luminous in its quiet strength. He spoke softly to the creatures at his feet, words almost lost in the hush of falling snow, and felt the enduring truth. Some wild hearts, once touched by care and trust, never truly leave. So pour yourself something warm, find your softest blanket, and let the world go quiet. This is a story worth hearing slowly. Thank you for staying through every small step, every moment of hope, and every heartbeat shared across snow, porch, and forest. Rest easy tonight, knowing that in some quiet corner of the world, trust has been nurtured, love has been given, and the wild hearts who chose it are still here, luminous and free. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.